Mr. Importer has just returned from a trade fair, where he made contact with potential suppliers. He specifically liked one of the suppliers, but is concerned that the supplier asks for part prepayment. He is concerned that this will put pressure on his liquidity, which also will be the case if he will be asked to open letters of credit. He is therefore looking for a better solution, as he himself is using factoring for his domestic sales. He thinks that maybe his factoring company would suggest a solution to this problem. He picks up the phone and arranges a meeting with his factoring company for the next day. When the factoring representative shows up, Mr. Importer tells her that he found a new potential supplier, but the supplier is demanding 30% prepayment. Even though Mr. Importer does want his products, he is not prepared to prepay. Ms. Import Factor tells him that maybe international factoring can help. Mr. Importer thinks this sounds interesting. Ms. Import Factor explains that through international factoring, she can guarantee the supplier payment and that her correspondent in the supplier's home country most likely will be able to offer the supplier financing. Mr. Importer wants to know how it works. Ms. Import Factor tells him that she needs the potential supplier's name and address and the sort of credit limit which is needed for the imports, based on the level of orders to be expected and the payment terms. She will tell her correspondent in their country that she has approved the credit limit on Mr. Importer, and the correspondent will then contact the supplier. Mr. Importer understands, but wants to know how it works in practice. Ms. Import Factor explains that he simply places the order. Then his supplier will send the invoices and shipping documents to him. On due day, Mr. Importer pays the Import Factor, who will transfer the amount through her correspondent to the supplier. Mr. Importer wants to know how his supplier can be sure that he'll be paid. Ms. Import Factor explains that if Mr. Importer does not pay, and does not have a valid dispute on the goods, Ms. Import Factor will have to pay, provided the amount outstanding is no more than the credit limit. Mr. Importer likes what he hears and wants to try it out. Think about this. Millions of companies worldwide are currently using international factoring. Why don't you ask one of the FCI members from your country to show what international factoring can do for your company? Ms. Import Factor immediately calls Mr. Export Factor, her correspondent in the country of the supplier. Ms. Import Factor tells Mr. Export Factor that she has just been talking to an importer who wants to do business with an exporter in Mr. Export Factor's country. She explains that she is prepared to guarantee the buyer's payments if a factoring agreement can be made with the exporter. Mr. Export Factor confirms that he'll take care of it immediately. Mr. Export Factor immediately checks all his in-house information on the exporter and also calls for credit reports from an outside agency. Mr. Export Factor is satisfied with his information and contacts the exporter. The exporter understands the benefits of international factoring, that he, instead of 30% prepayment, will have a guarantee for the whole amount, that collection service is included, that he can have 80% pre-financing, that the agreement can cover all his exports. When the contract is signed and the credit limits approved, this is how it works. 1. Exporter sends goods and invoice to importer. 2. Exporter sends copy of invoice to Export Factor. 3. Export Factor pays exporter 80% of the invoice amount. 4. Export Factor transmits invoice data to Import Factor. 5. Import Factor collects payment from importer. 6. The remaining 20% is paid to exporter. Now what about your company? How can it profit by working with international factoring? Find out today by calling one of the FCI members in your country.